When the wind howls across a Wyoming winter and a scarred drifter hears a faint cry echoing from a frozen well, does he ride away like every other man or risk everything to save the woman thrown there to die, knowing her rescue could cost him his own life? The wind had teeth that day. It gnawed right through my worn wool coat, a bitter, relentless cold that promised a hard winter for the high desert of Wyoming. Snow fine as dust swirled across the frozen ruts of the road, clinging to the skeletal remains of sagebrush. My horse, a sturdy roan named Boulder, snorted clouds of steam, his head bowed against the wind. We were headed for a place called Salvation Creek, a name far too hopeful for the collection of miserable shacks huddled against the unforgiving landscape. I had no business in Salvation Creek other than necessity. Coffee cartridges, maybe a plug of tobacco to chew on through the long frozen nights. At 42, my life had been pared down to such simple, grim necessities. The man I was before, the husband, the father, the Army scout with dreams, had been buried years ago under the weight of loss and violence. All that was left was Elias Thorne, a man with a limp from a Cheyenne arrow in his youth and a deeper ache in his soul that no winter could touch. The limp was a constant reminder, a metronome counting out the beat of a life I'd rather forget. People learn not to look too long at the scars on my face or the haunted stillness in my eyes. A drifter, they'd call me, and I suppose that's what I was. I drifted because staying in one place meant risking the one thing I had left to lose the calloused shell around my heart. I tied Boulder to a frost-covered hitching post outside the trading post, the only building that looked like it might withstand another blizzard. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke, oiled leather, and unwashed men. I gathered my supplies in silence, my movements economical, attracting no more attention than a shadow. I paid the proprietor, a man with eyes as gray and cold as the winter sky, and turned to leave. My plan was simple: ride a few miles out, find a sheltered bluff, and make a camp that was nothing more than a fire and a bedroll. I wanted to be a ghost on the wind before the sun, a pale disk in the sky dipped below the horizon. Then I heard it. It was so faint at first I thought it was just the wind whistling through the poorly chinked logs of the trading post. But this sound had a different quality. It was thin, reedy, and laced with a despair that cut through the cold. I stopped dead, my hand on Boulder's rein, and listened. The wind howled, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But there it was again, a ragged thread of a voice nearly torn apart by the gale. A plea. Help. A man learns to ignore things on the frontier. You ignore the whispers in a saloon, the desperation in a homesteader's eyes, the lonely graves that dot the plains. Getting involved is a fool's game, a currency paid in blood and grief. My past was a graveyard of voices I hadn't been able to save, and their echoes were the only company I kept most nights. I told myself to mount my horse, to ride away and let the wind swallow that sound. It was not my trouble, but I didn't move. The voice came again, weaker this time, a final trembling surrender. Something inside me, a stubborn buried piece of the man I used to be, refused to let it go. Cursing myself for a fool, I followed the sound, my boots crunching on the frozen, snow-dusted ground. It led me away from the meager warmth of the town toward an old, abandoned well at the edge of the settlement. Its stone lip was capped with ice, the wooden frame for the bucket and rope long since rotted away. I leaned over the edge, my breath catching in my throat, forming a thick white plume. Down in the darkness at the bottom of that 20-foot pit was a woman. She was crumpled on the frozen mud at the bottom, a small broken shape in the gloom. From her dark braided hair and the simple cut of her worn buckskin dress, I knew she was native Shoshone by the look of her. Her face was turned up toward the sliver of gray sky, and even from that distance I could see the raw scrapes on her cheeks where she'd hit the stones on the way down. One arm was bent at an angle that made my stomach clench. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, the deerskin gaping to show the pale skin beneath. She was shivering violently, her body's desperate, futile attempt to generate warmth against the killing cold. When my shadow fell over the opening, she flinched. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was a silent, desperate plea not to be abandoned. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. I knew towns like Salvation Creek. I knew the kind of men who lived in them, men who saw a native woman as less than human, an object for their cruelty or their lust. She wasn't down there by accident. Someone had put her there, thrown her away like garbage left for the cold to finish the job. The urge to ride away was a physical force, a screaming in my gut. This was the kind of trouble that didn't just follow you. It clung to you, stained you. Every instinct honed by years of survival told me to turn my back. She wasn't my kin, not my responsibility. My life was complicated enough with just my own ghosts. But then she moved. With a groan that I felt more than heard, she tried to push herself up with her good arm. She struggled, her body trembling with pain and exhaustion, and then collapsed back onto the frozen ground. But she had tried. Even broken and freezing in the dark, she had tried to fight. That was what broke me. I couldn't be the man who walked away from that. Not again. With a heavy sigh that felt like it came from the soles of my boots, I uncoiled the thick rope from my saddle. The hemp was stiff with cold, and my fingers felt clumsy as I tied one end securely to the hitching post. I tossed the other end down into the well. It landed with a soft thud near her. My voice when it came was rough from disuse, but I kept it steady. "Take hold. Use your good arm." She stared up at the rope, then at me, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a flicker of disbelief. A stranger, a white man, offering a hand. After what others who looked like me had done to her, I couldn't blame her for the fear. But she had no other choice. Her trembling fingers reached out and closed around the rope. I dug my heels into the frozen earth, leaned back and pulled. Every muscle in my back and shoulders screamed in protest. The old arrow wound in my leg throbbed with a fiery pain. The rope groaned, and I could hear her sharp gasps of pain as the rough fibers bit into her skin. It was slow, agonizing work. Inch by agonizing inch, she rose, her moccasined feet scraping against the icy stones of the well, her body twisting. Finally, her hand appeared over the rim. I lunged forward, grabbing her wrist, my fingers sinking into her cold flesh, and hauled her the rest of the way out. She collapsed against me, a dead weight, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow sobs. The torn front of her dress exposed the curve of her collarbone and the start of her breast. With a surge of shame that was painful to watch, she tried to pull the tattered buckskin together. I didn't look away. I didn't offer empty words of comfort. I simply shrugged out of my heavy wool coat, the one lined with sheepskin, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but it was warm and it was a shield. She went still beneath its weight, her shivering slowly subsiding into faint tremors. I took a moment to truly look at her. She was young, maybe 25 at most. A dark bruise was already purpling on her cheekbone, and her broken arm was beginning to swell. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, were dark and sharp, holding a defiant spark that even this horror hadn't extinguished. The question of what to do next was already answered. I couldn't leave her here. Not to the mercy of this town, and not to the mercy of the winter night. With a grunt, I hooked one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her as carefully as I could. She winced but didn't cry out. She was lighter than I expected, almost frail. I laid her across Boulder's saddle, then took the reins in my hand. I didn't know her name. I didn't know what she'd done to earn such hatred, but I knew she'd been left to die, and I was the only one who had answered her call. As the last light of day bled from the sky and the shacks of Salvation Creek disappeared behind us, I felt the familiar heavy weight of a choice settle in my chest. The kind of choice you couldn't ride away from. The kind that changes the path you're on whether you want it to or not. I led Boulder up the trail into the hills, my limp more pronounced in the gathering dusk, each step a protest from my aching leg. The woman, I still didn't have a name for her, lay slumped across the saddle, clutching the collar of my coat. The wind was a physical presence now, whipping snow into our faces and stealing the breath from my lungs. The temperature was dropping fast. If we didn't find shelter soon, the cold would claim us both. My camp was a poor excuse for a home tucked into the lee of a rock outcropping that offered some protection from the north wind. It was just a fire pit, a canvas lean-to, and my bedroll. It was a lonely setup meant for one man and his ghosts. Tonight it would have to do for two. I lifted her down from the horse, my muscles straining. She was barely conscious, her head lolling against my shoulder. I set her down gently on my bedroll near the fire pit, propping her against my saddle. She was too weak to even sit up on her own. Her good hand, I noticed, briefly clutched my sleeve before she seemed to realize what she was doing and let go. Starting a fire was the first and most important ritual. My hands were numb, but they moved with the practiced ease of long habit. I shaved tinder from a dry piece of pine, struck a spark with my flint and steel, and coaxed the fragile flame to life with dry twigs until it was strong enough to catch the larger pieces of wood. The fire roared to life, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness and the killing cold. Its flickering light danced across her face, illuminating the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the dark slash of a cut on her temple, and the raw scrapes on her skin. She kept tugging the coat around her, a constant instinctual gesture to cover the torn dress beneath. I melted snow in my small pot over the fire, and when it was warm, I held the tin cup to her lips. She drank greedily, the warm water spilling down her chin. When the cup was empty, I let the silence stretch for a long moment, the only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. "Name?" I asked, my voice low. She hesitated, her dark eyes watching me, weighing me. I could see the conflict in them. Why trust me? Why tell me anything? But after a long pause, her voice came out, a rough, dry whisper. "Lena." I nodded once. "Elias." No more was needed. We were two strangers bound by a moment of violence, and names were enough for now. The stories of our scars could wait. She watched me as I moved about the small camp, my limp a familiar rhythm. Her gaze followed my rifle leaning against a rock, then my saddlebags, then back to me. Her unspoken questions hung in the air between us. "Why did you help me? What do you want from me?" I didn't have an easy answer, so I offered the only one that felt true. "I heard you call." I looked into the flames as I said it. That was enough. Her eyes held mine for a moment, searching. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she looked away and didn't ask again. I made a thin broth from a piece of dried venison, letting it simmer until it was hot and savory. I gave her half, and she ate with her good hand, her movements stiff with pain and pride. She was starving, but she refused to show it, taking slow, deliberate sips. When she was done, she leaned back against the saddle and closed her eyes. Exhaustion finally claimed her. But I noticed she didn't truly let go. Didn't fall into a deep sleep until she saw me settle on the other side of the fire. My rifle across my knees, my gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. I sat there for hours long after her breathing had evened out into the steady rhythm of sleep. The cold was a living thing pressing in from all sides, and I fed the fire stick by stick, keeping the circle of warmth and light intact. By pulling her from that well, I had done more than save her life. I had painted a target on both our backs. The men who put her there wouldn't be pleased to know she'd survived. And if they found out I was the one who'd pulled her out, their hatred for her would extend to me. The smart thing to do would be to leave at first light, point her toward a different town, a different life, and ride in the opposite direction. But as I watched the firelight play over her bruised face, I knew I wouldn't. The part of me I thought was long dead, the part that answered a cry for help in the dark, wouldn't let me. The fire was a bed of glowing embers when the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. I hadn't slept. My back was a solid knot of pain, and the cold had settled deep in my bones, making my old wound throb with a dull, persistent ache. I rose slowly, my joints protesting, and added wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life. When I turned back, Lena was awake. She was sitting up, my coat clutched around her, her eyes tracking my every move. The moment she recognized me, the tension in her shoulders eased, but only slightly. That look, fear sharpening into a grim readiness, told me everything I needed to know about the life she'd led. She was ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice, even as broken as she was. I couldn't help but respect that. I handed her a cup of hot, weak coffee, which she took with a low murmur of thanks. The swelling in her arm was worse, the skin a mottled purple and stretched tight. The makeshift binding I'd used was not enough. "It needs a proper splint," I said, my voice still rough. "If it heals wrong, you'll lose the use of it for good." Her gaze didn't waver. "Why are you helping me?" The question was quiet, but it was not timid. She had asked it with her eyes the night before. Now she demanded an answer with her voice. I stoked the fire, watching the sparks fly up into the cold air. I could have given her a simple answer, something that meant nothing. But she deserved the truth, or at least a piece of it, because I've walked away from voices like yours before, I said, my eyes fixed on the flames. I couldn't live with myself if I did it again. She watched me for a long time, as if trying to see the ghosts I was talking about. Finally, she gave a single sharp nod. The question was settled. I spent the next hour fashioning a splint from straight branches of juniper, padding it with strips of cloth torn from a spare shirt. When I reached for her arm, she flinched, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. "Hold still," I said, my voice gentle but firm. She met my eyes, her own jaw clenched. But she did as I asked. My hands, though rough and calloused, were steady. I'd tended to enough wounds in my time, my own and others, to know what I was doing. When I was finished, her arm was immobilized against her body, secure and protected. I saw the sheen of sweat on her forehead, but also the profound relief in her eyes. Later, as we shared a meager breakfast of hardtack softened in broth, she spoke again, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They threw me in the well because their grain was stolen. Jed, the big one, he said I took it." She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. "I took nothing." "I know," I said. And I did. It was the oldest, ugliest story in the West. When something went wrong, find the nearest person who looked different and lay the blame at their feet. Her people had been scapegoats for generations. Her innocence was as plain to me as the snow on the mountains. She seemed startled by my immediate belief. She must have been so used to doubt and accusation that simple acceptance was a foreign thing. A flicker of something gratitude, maybe, or just relief crossed her face before she lowered her eyes to the fire. The day passed in a quiet rhythm of survival. I checked my snares, resetting them in the snow. She in turn refused to be helpless. Using her good arm, she gathered firewood, stacking it neatly near the fire. The effort clearly cost her, but I didn't stop her. Work, even simple work, was a way of holding on to your dignity. By late afternoon, our small, grim camp felt different. It was a shared space marked by our combined efforts. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and purple, she sat across the fire from me. "You could have left me there," she said. It wasn't a question. I just nodded. I didn't. That night the cold was even more severe. The fire felt small against the vast frozen darkness. I laid out my bedroll, my only blanket, and motioned for her to sit. She hesitated, pride warring with need. But the cold was a powerful argument. She sat beside me on the thick wool, close enough that I could feel the faint tremors that still ran through her body. We didn't speak. We just sat side by side, two strangers sharing a small circle of warmth. When her shoulder brushed against my arm, neither of us moved away. I stared into the flames, but I was aware of every breath she took beside me. I hadn't meant to let anyone into my life. I hadn't wanted the responsibility, the risk, the inevitable pain. But here she was wrapped in my coat, sleeping beside my fire, and I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute that there was no turning back. The next morning the sky was the color of lead, and a few stray snowflakes drifted down from the heavy clouds. I woke to find Lena already awake, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The tightness around her eyes told me she hadn't slept well. She tried to stand, bracing herself with her good hand, but her legs, weak from hunger and injury, gave way. I was moving before I even thought about it, catching her before she hit the frozen ground. Her body went rigid in my arms. Pride was a fierce thing in her, and she hated this weakness. I understood that feeling better than most. The limp in my leg had taught me all about the humiliation of a body that betrayed you. "Easy now," I said, my voice low, as I helped her back to a sitting position on a flat stone. "You push too hard, you'll only break yourself worse." She stared at the fire, her jaw set, her breath coming in sharp, angry little puffs. She wouldn't look at me. To spare her pride, I busied myself with breakfast, melting snow and dropping strips of dried venison into the pot. The savory smell of the hot broth soon filled the cold air. I handed her a cup. "Drink. It'll give you some strength." While she drank, my thoughts drifted back to Salvation Creek. A lesser man might have taken her back, demanded justice from the law. But I knew better. In a town like that, the law was whatever the loudest, angriest men said it was. A sheriff would see an injured Apache woman and a drifter and call it a Tuesday. There was no justice for her there, only more danger. After she ate, she tried to stand again, this time more slowly. She used a sturdy branch as a crutch and took 3 shaky steps before she had to sit again. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. I returned from checking my snares with a rabbit, and I saw in her eyes a flicker of that defiant spark again. She was a fighter. While I skinned the rabbit, she finally told me her story, the words coming out in a flat, bitter tone. She'd gone to the storeroom asking for scraps, and they'd turned her away. That night the grain sacks were torn open by a bear, most likely. But it was easier to blame the Indian woman who'd been begging. It was always easier. "I told you," I said, not looking up from my work. "I believe you." I felt her eyes on me, searching my face for any sign of doubt. She found none. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease just a fraction. As the day wore on, a new rhythm settled between us. I showed her how to rewrap the splint to keep it clean. When I went to the creek to break through the ice for fresh water, she gathered and stacked firewood. At one point, I noticed a tear in the shoulder of my coat, the one she was wearing. She took a small leather pouch from her belt, one I hadn't noticed before, and produced a needle and a thread of sinew. Awkwardly, with one hand, she began to stitch the tear. Her movements were slow and clumsy, but she didn't stop until the seam was closed. She didn't say a word, just handed it back to me. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. An acknowledgement. A trade. My protection for her care. That evening, the unspoken bond between us deepened. The cold pressed in, and we sat closer together on the blanket than before. Hesitantly, she placed her good hand on mine. Her skin was warm, the touch startlingly gentle. I didn't pull away. I turned my hand over, letting our fingers intertwine. The silence that fell between us was no longer empty. It was filled with a fragile, growing trust. She leaned against me then, her head resting on my shoulder. I could feel the weariness in her, a bone-deep exhaustion that went far beyond her physical injuries. I let my own body relax for the first time in what felt like years. The ghosts of my past were still there, watching from the edges of the firelight. But for the first time, their whispers were drowned out by the steady sound of another person's breathing beside me. The camp was no longer just a place to survive the night. It was beginning to feel like something else. And though no promises had been made, I knew I was no longer just passing through. My drifting had come to a stop here in the frozen hills with a broken woman who was teaching me what it meant to be human again. The night stretched deep and cold, the stars like chips of ice in the black sky. Lena slept against me, a solid breathing weight that was both a comfort and a burden. For years, the only thing I'd held at night was my rifle. Now I felt the delicate rise and fall of her chest, the warmth of her breath against my neck. It was a terrifyingly foreign feeling. When dawn broke, painting the snow in shades of pale rose and gold, I rose quietly so as not to wake her. The world was still hushed by the fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight. As I coaxed the fire back to life, she stirred. Her eyes opened, and when they found me, the fear that was always lurking in their depths was gone. In its place was something else, something soft and tentative. Trust. "The swelling's gone down some," I said, checking the splint on her arm. "You keep it still, you'll have the use of it again." She watched my hands as I worked. "You know how to heal." "Had to learn," I said, my voice flat. "The army didn't send doctors out on patrol. We patched each other up, or we died." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, memories of boys bleeding out in the dust, rising unbidden. She heard the ghosts in my voice, I think, because she didn't press for more. That day, our quiet partnership continued. I hunted. She tended the camp. She moved with more confidence, her steps less shaky. At one point, she stumbled while carrying the water pot from the creek. I lunged and caught it before it fell, my other hand steadying her arm. We were suddenly close, face to face, her breath a warm cloud in the frigid air. Her eyes, dark and deep, held mine for a heart-stopping moment. A current passed between us, something unspoken and powerful. She stepped back quickly, a flush rising on her cheeks, and I let her go, my own heart hammering against my ribs. Later, as I sat sharpening my knife, she sat across the fire from me, mending another tear in my coat. I watched the firelight play on the soft curve of her cheek, the concentration in her eyes. She looked up and caught me watching. This time she didn't look away. A small, shy smile touched her lips. That night, when we sat by the fire, the space between us had vanished entirely. Our shoulders touched our legs, pressed together for warmth. After a long silence, she turned to me. Her hand came up to rest on my chest, a light, deliberate touch. Her eyes searched mine, asking a question she didn't dare speak. I had spent years building walls around my heart, fortifying it against any hint of tenderness. But with one look, she dismantled them all. I leaned in and touched my lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, at first hesitant. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and a loneliness so profound it ached. Then she pressed into me, her good hand moving to cup my jaw, and the kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and desperate, acclaiming. It was the kiss of two survivors, two people who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched with anything other than violence. When we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine. Her eyes closed, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. For the first time since I'd pulled her from that well, I saw her face completely free of fear. My own voice was a low rasp. "I won't take what's not freely given, Lena." Her eyes opened and they were clear and bright. "I stay because I choose Elias," she whispered. The words settled deep inside me, heavier and more binding than any vow. That night when we shared the blanket, it was not as strangers seeking warmth, but as two people who had found an anchor in a storm. She curled against my side, and I put my arm around her, holding her carefully. The fire burned low, the stars watched from above, and for the first time in a decade, I slept without dreaming of the dead. But peace, I knew, was a fragile thing. The men in Salvation Creek had not forgotten, and sooner or later they would come looking for what they believed was theirs. The days that followed were a quiet grace period. A fragile peace settled over our small camp. We spoke little, but our silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding. I taught her how to set snares, and she showed me which winter roots could be dug from the frozen ground and boiled into a nourishing soup. Her arm began to heal the deep purple of the bruises, fading to a pale yellow. She began to smile, small, fleeting smiles that lit up her face and made my chest ache. I found myself watching her, constantly memorizing the way she moved, the sound of her voice, the defiant spark that was returning to her eyes. This woman who had been thrown away to die was possessed of a strength that humbled me. I, who had survived battles and blizzards, had done so by becoming hard, by closing myself off. She had survived by holding onto a core of resilience that they had failed to break. But the outside world could not be held at bay forever. Our supplies were dwindling. We needed flour, salt, and more ammunition. We needed to go back to town. "You go back, they will see you with me," she said one evening, her voice quiet. She was stating a fact, not expressing a fear, but I could hear the tension beneath the words. I met her gaze across the fire. "I won't leave you here alone," I said, "and I won't hide you. We ride in together." It was a declaration, a choice. I was no longer just the man who had pulled her from a well. I was the man who stood with her. She chewed her lip, her eyes searching my face. Then she gave a firm nod. Riding into Salvation Creek felt like riding into the belly of a beast. Every head turned as we came down the main street. Whispers followed us like eddies of snow. The drifter and the Apache woman. It was a scandal and a challenge rolled into one. Jed and his two friends were standing outside the saloon just as I knew they would be. Their faces hardened when they saw us, their mouths curling into sneers. Jed stepped forward, blocking our path. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow near my horse's feet. "Told you to get rid of her, Thorn. She's trouble." I swung down from the saddle, my movements slow and deliberate. My limp felt more pronounced, but I stood my ground, planting my feet firmly. My voice when I spoke was low and cold, carrying in the still winter air. "She stays with me. You got a problem with that? You got a problem with me?" Jed's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "She's a thief. She don't belong with decent folk. The only indecency I see here," I said, my eyes locking onto his, "is a man who'd throw a woman down a well to die. You want to call someone a thief, Jed? You and your friends stole her life. I'm just here to make sure you don't get a second chance." The street had gone silent. Everyone was watching. This was it. The moment the line was drawn, Jed's fingers twitched. But my hand was already on the worn grip of my Colt. He was fast, but he was sloppy, fueled by whiskey and hate. I was fueled by something else entirely, a purpose. He saw it in my eyes. The cold, calm certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth fighting for. For a long, tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then with a curse, Jed let his hand drop. He spat again, then turned and stomped back into the saloon, his friends trailing behind him like curs. The spell was broken. The town slowly came back to life, but the point had been made. I offered my hand to Lena, and she slid down from the saddle, her fingers gripping mine tightly. In her eyes, I saw not just gratitude, but pride. We were no longer hiding. We bought our supplies, ignoring the stares and the whispers. When we rode out of town, no one stood in our way. The road back to the hills felt different, lighter. We had faced them together and won. Not with a gunfight, but with something stronger, resolve. That evening back at the camp, I didn't just rebuild the fire. I started clearing a larger patch of ground. I found 2 tall pines and began stripping them of their branches. Lena watched me, a puzzled look on her face. "What are you doing? This place was just a stopover," I said, my axe biting into the wood. "But I'm tired of drifting." I stopped and looked at her, the setting sun casting a golden glow around her. "If you'll stay, I want to build us a home, a proper cabin." Her eyes widened and then they softened, filling with a light I'd never seen before. She walked over to me, placing her good hand over mine on the handle of the axe. "You saved me from the darkness of that well, Elias," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Now you want to build me a place in the sun." My own voice was rough. "Not just a place, Lena, a life." That night, as the stars blazed in the cold, clear sky, I took a small object from my pocket. It was a simple ring carved from the dark wood of a juniper branch that I had been whittling during the quiet hours. I took her hand and slipped it onto her finger. "It's not much," I said. Her answer was not in words. She leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was full of promises and tomorrows. She rested her head against my chest, her hand tight in mine, the simple wooden ring a silent testament to the bond between us. The wind sighed through the pines and the fire crackled, sending sparks up to join the stars. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place, but for the first time in more years than I could count, I wasn't facing it alone. The hollow space inside me, the one I thought would be my companion until the grave, was gone. In its place was the steady breathing warmth of the woman beside me. We had found our own salvation not in a town, but in the shelter we had built in each other's hearts. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.